You're listening to Kingdom Thinking, a podcast series designed to start a conversation around the deeper intellectual questions surrounding life, faith, and meaning. Here are a collection of questions, ideas, and stories that I hope will challenge you to think about your own beliefs, and perhaps introduce you to new perspectives, regardless of where you are in your journey. I'm your host, Al Butcher, and I can't wait to share this episode with you. This episode will look at one of the most commonly used arguments for and justifications for faith. Particularly, I find, among Christians, the argument from intelligent design. How could such complex life as exists in our world arise if not for the presence of a designer? My family lives all over the world, so any time that we actually get to spend with one another is a real treat. I remember one particular time when my grandmother, we call her Granny, came to visit us in the most recent summer, and one conversation having particularly stuck out to me. I remember sitting with Granny on the patio on a Sunday afternoon. She was knitting while I was reading a book. I watched her look out over the garden at the grass, the flowers, and the plants before she turned to me and exclaimed, "You know, Alistair, God is so very clever," before returning to her knitting. This comment really stuck to me because I think that for many Christians, significant parts of our faith are motivated by a similar impulse and wonder. Many Christians wonder about the world and universe in a similar way to my grandmother. In fact, this is not actually a new argument or idea. St. Thomas Aquinas included it as the fifth of his famous 5 proofs for God under the title of the teleological argument. The word teleology is one that I'm going to be using a lot over the course of this episode, so I thought I'd just explain what it means. Teleology, in theological circles, means to examine and consider both the design and purpose of something in the material world. So when we talk about the teleology of something, we're talking about the fact that it seems to be designed for a particular purpose. Therefore, a teleological argument is one that looks at the things in the material world and observes how complex they seem to be and how they seem to fulfill particular purposes, and then argue that a designer is the best possible explanation for this. Teleological arguments and intelligent design arguments refer to the same thing. The teleological argument has always traditionally been an argument made by Christian biologists. Many look at the complexity of living creatures, particularly the human body, and how it has so many intricate parts serving particular purposes. For example, the brain is the center of a computer system that is massively more complex and wonderful than the greatest one ever built by mankind, sending billions of bits of information to control every single action undertaken by the human body. In fact, right now, your brain is transforming vibrations in the air created by whatever speakers or device you happen to be listening to this podcast on into a coherent message, a language that conveys meaning to you. We have thousands of miles of blood vessels stretching throughout our body, carrying the food and oxygen required by every single part of our body to function in our bloodstream. We have thousands more miles of nerves stretching throughout our entire bodies, carrying electrical signals around to communicate. Psalm chapter 139 verse 14 says, "I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well." This is true in an extremely biological sense as well as a metaphorical sense. Even the most ardent atheist would agree here that the human body is an absolute marvel to behold. As many theologians have suggested, our bodies are too complex to have arisen from random forces, given their extraordinary complexity. For example, William Paley compared the human body to a watch in his book called Natural Theology, where he used the following analogy. Suppose I was walking across a field and I found a watch lying on the ground. It would be very strange for me to suppose that the watch had lain there forever, or that the pieces had somehow come together of their own accord, perhaps by falling out of a tree or rolling down a hill. No, I would look at the watch and observe its complexity, and in particular the purpose it seems to serve, telling the time, and would then conclude that this watch must have been made by someone. Someone who created the watch and designed it to fulfill a specific purpose, that is to say, telling the time. Paley was essentially arguing that, looking at the incredible complexity, for example, within the human body, as well as the purposes that so many of our body's systems seem to fulfill, that it would be reasonable and in fact natural to conclude that they had been designed to meet those particular purposes. This argument did, in its own turn, come under fire from the famous atheist and naturalist Richard Dawkins in his book The Blind Watchmaker. Dawkins directly attacks this argument by citing evolution as a process by which an entirely natural process can produce complexity with only random forces at play. Dawkins argues that life in its current state evolved that way through natural selection, and thus that complexity in living beings should not be at all surprising to us. Dawkins' argument has some merit. Evolution is a very effective method for separating out members of a species not suited to survival and ensuring that their genes are not passed on. Unfortunately, my views on evolution and its relative merits and failings will have to wait for another episode, but trust me, it is surely coming. However, while it seems as though the teleological torch has dimmed within the field of biology, faithful physicists and cosmologists have continued the fight, evolving the teleological argument into its more currently used and effective form. Physicists and cosmologists appeal to a much wider teleology than biologists do, arguing that the universe itself is incredibly fine-tuned for intelligent life. Our universe is governed and maintained in balance by many different forces and interactions, many of whose laws contain constants that affect the strength of these forces, which must fall within incredibly narrow ranges for the universe to exist in its current state. For example, if the constant describing gravitational force was changed by 1 in 10 duocillion, or 10 to the power of negative 40, then life-permitting stars like the Sun could never have formed. The fields of physics, astrophysics, quantum physics, and biochemistry are filled with examples like this, where even slight variations in a single variable would have spelled absolute disaster. Furthermore, these values have incredibly complex relationships with one another that are required for life also. So not only did these variables have to themselves fall within very specific margins, those margins had to be in near perfect relationship with hundreds of other constants and variables. Factors like the initial density of the universe, its initial temperature, the strong and weak nuclear forces, all combine to create a universe which can expand in its current way and permit life, which seems bizarrely unlikely. As we continue to make discoveries about the inner and earlier workings of our universe, the more and more delicate this balance seems to be. This appearance of cosmic teleology is so incredibly strong that many feel it demands an explanation. How, if the universe was created entirely from random quantum forces, does it exist in such a delicate state of balance and order? Given what we know about the universe and the fact that it tends towards higher levels of entropy and chaos, not lower, this seems to be a very peculiar state of events. Traditionally, such considerations have led to questions of divine design, but many scientists and cosmologists find the idea of the God hypothesis to be impossible or unpalatable. As a consequence, many have turned to two primary explanations of the fine-tuning that exists within our universe instead of the God hypothesis. The first of these is a modification of something called the anthropic principle. The basic statement of the anthropic principle is as follows. If a universe has intelligent life in it, then its most basic features must be of a type that allow intelligent life to exist. This statement of the anthropic principle is obvious. Of course, if a universe has intelligent life in it, then it must be the kind of universe that allows intelligent life to exist. In the same way, a planet with plants on it must be the kind of planet that will allow plants to grow on it. It therefore follows from the anthropic principle that we shouldn't really be surprised that we don't find features of the universe that would not allow intelligent life to exist. If we could find such features, then we wouldn't exist. This, again, is completely logical. We can't find any property of the universe that would mean we could not exist, since we do exist. However, the anthropic principle is often stretched a little bit further than this to make the following statement: that we should not be surprised when we find features of our universe that allow us to exist. Now, this is a completely unfair extension. To illustrate this point, consider the analogy of being dragged before a firing squad of 100 riflemen, none of whom are firing blanks. You stand before them, you hear the command given to fire, and you hear all the gunshots, but afterwards you find that you are still very much alive. By the anthropic principle, you should not be surprised that you do not observe yourself to be dead. It would be impossible for you to observe yourself to be dead, so this should not surprise you. However, you should nonetheless be very surprised to find yourself alive, because it is very unlikely for every soldier in the firing squad to have missed you. Therefore, it's completely right and normal for us to be surprised that our universe has such excessively improbable features which allow us to exist. It is right for us to be surprised by the delicate balance contained within our universe. And thus, the naturalist is again left with the problem of design. How can such a complex and delicately balanced universe be the product of brutally random forces? Finally, something that is often smuggled into atheist arguments on the subject is the idea of multiple universes. It is argued, and has in fact almost become a staple of pop culture, the idea of many universes. It's argued that infinitely many universes exist where all possible outcomes are played out, and that we just happen to exist in one of the very few with intelligent life in it. If this were true, then the existence of our universe suddenly seems probable. I mean, if every possible universe exists in the multiverse somewhere, then surely ours had to come along at some point. I say that this point is smuggled into atheist arguments because it is so regularly brought forward with an absolute lack of evidence. This idea of multiple universes or multiple realities or alternate dimensions has permeated New Age thinking to such a startling degree, particularly given its numerous and gaping flaws as a metaphysical model. Where do all of these universes exist? Do they all exist in some weird, timeless superspace that we can never enter or understand? How many of them are there? To account for every possible universal initial condition, there would have to be a continuously infinite number of universes, which is entirely paradoxical. Where do they all come from? Is a new one made at every moment where things could have been different? If so, how is time and space split to create these new universes? If universes do split, then there must be an almighty force behind doing so, and then, while desperately trying to avoid the God hypothesis using the multiverse theory, we arrive at another question of a higher and more difficult to explain teleology. The multiverse theory has no way of being proven or disproven, and even those who advocate it agree that we have no way of observing, investigating, measuring, or verifying the existence of multiple universes. It is thus entirely moot, with no way of being verified or talked about in concrete terms. Comparing this with Christianity, a belief system that claims God came to earth in a historically measurable, testable way, performed in front of hundreds of witnesses the most historically attested events and miracles to have ever occurred in human history. And yet, it is Christians and God believers who are accused of being anti-intellectual, irrational, and making claims that they cannot prove. No, these arguments will not do. One has the sense that the multiverse theory is almost an intentional avoidance of the God hypothesis. Make no mistake, the source of such a delicate balance in our universe is a philosophical question, not a scientific one, and belief in a designer is no more objectionable than any other satisfactory belief to the contrary. As Christians, we believe simply that the universe is well balanced and well designed because it was made that way. To me, this seems to be a far surer philosophical and metaphysical basis for the teleology of the universe. Supposing the existence of a designer from looking at the natural world is neither irrational nor is it unreasonable. In fact, when weighed up against the alternative explanations, belief in God seems to be the least grand a conclusion to draw. Werner Heisenberg, the scientist who discovered the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, once said, "The first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is there waiting for you." The more and more we study our natural world, the more we realize that the teleology and beautiful design cries out for explanation. Finally, Max Planck, the founder of the field of quantum physics, once said, "As a physicist, that is, a man who has devoted his whole life to an entirely intellectual science, the exploration of matter, surely no one would suspect me of being given to flights of fancy. And so, having studied the atom, I am telling you that there is no matter like it. All matter arises and persists only due to a force that causes the atomic particles to vibrate, holding them together in the tiniest of solar systems, the atom. Yet, in the whole universe, there is no force that is either intelligent or eternal. And we must therefore assume that behind this force there is a conscious, intelligent mind or spirit. This is the very origin of all matter." Thank you for listening to this episode of Kingdom Thinking. I release new episodes every week, so jump on the Kingdom Thinking Facebook page for notifications about episodes as they come out, as well as information about the episodes like transcripts. Until next time, have a great week and God bless.